June 19th, 1944. Ensign Kenji Takahashi sat in the cockpit of his Zero fighter starving, knowing he would die today. 7 hours later, an American pilot would hand him a sandwich, and that simple act would change everything he believed about the enemy, about his country, and about what it means to be free. The morning sun rose over the Pacific Ocean, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. 200 miles separated two young men who had never met, who spoke different languages, who had been taught to hate each other. One believed he would die with honor for his emperor. The other believed he would die protecting freedom. Only one of them understood what they were really fighting for. Aboard the Japanese carrier, Akatsuki Takahashi gripped the edge of his cockpit and tried to stop his hands from shaking. 19 years old, 3 months of training. This would be his first combat mission. Around him, 300 aircraft prepared to launch into the dawn. The deck crews shouted orders. Engines roared to life. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the salt air. His breakfast sat heavy in his stomach. A handful of cold rice, a cup of plain water. Nothing more. There had been nothing more for 6 months. The Imperial Japanese Navy was running low on everything except orders to fight and propaganda about inevitable victory. Takahashi reached inside his flight suit and touched the letter tucked next to his heart. His mother's handwriting. Her final words to her only son. 200 miles to the east, Lieutenant James Carson stood on the flight deck of the USS Lexington, finishing his second cup of coffee. 25 years old, 87 combat missions, 12 confirmed kills. He knew what was coming today because American intelligence had broken the Japanese naval codes 2 years earlier. Every order the enemy admiral issued landed on American desks within hours. Carson's breakfast had been scrambled eggs, crispy bacon-buttered toast, and fresh coffee with real cream. The bacon had crackled in the pan. The eggs had been hot and fluffy. The toast had been made from bread baked that morning in the ship's galley. He could have eaten more if he wanted. The mess hall would serve seconds to any pilot who asked. He wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin and looked out across the ocean. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Japanese pilots were preparing to attack. Young men, probably terrified, certainly convinced they were fighting for a righteous cause. Carson remembered being that certain once. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. He had watched the Arizona explode. He had seen friends die in the burning oil. He had learned that certainty without preparation gets you killed. The contrast between these two young men, these two breakfasts, these two beliefs about what the day would bring, tells you everything you need to know about why the battle unfolded the way it did. One side had been preparing for 2 years, learning from every mistake, building an integrated system of radar, radio, control, superior, aircraft, and tactical doctrine, based on survival rather than glory. The other side had been told that warrior spirit would overcome material disadvantage, that honor mattered more than fuel, that dying for the emperor was the highest calling. One of these beliefs was about to be tested. The other was about to be shattered. If you served in the Pacific War, you remember this. The fear before battle, the knowledge that some of your friends wouldn't come home, the weight of fighting an enemy you'd been taught to see as less than human. If your father or grandfather served, you've heard the stories. Drop a comment telling us where your family was in June 1944. This story belongs to all of us. It's about the moment when hate met humanity and lost. Takahashi climbed into his Zero at 0530 hours. The fighter was painted dark green with a red circle on each wing. The rising sun, the symbol of an empire that stretched from the Chinese coast to the edge of India, from the frozen north of Manchuria to the tropical islands of the South Pacific. An empire built on the belief that the Japanese people were destined to rule Asia, that Western powers were decadent and weak, that American soldiers lacked the discipline and spirit to stand against the samurai code. His instructor's final words echoed in his mind. Your Zero can outturn their fighters. Use your agility. Get inside their turning radius. When they try to follow, you will have the advantage. The Americans are cowards who value their lives more than victory. Show them what true warriors fight like. Takahashi strapped himself into the narrow cockpit. The seat was hard metal with minimal padding. The instrument panel was basic. Airspeed, altitude, fuel gauge, engine temperature, compass, nothing else. Japanese aircraft were built light to maximize range and maneuverability. That meant no armor plating to protect the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent fires when bullets struck. No redundant systems. You flew fast and turned tight, or you died. He thought about his mother's letter one more time before tucking it securely inside his flight suit. Kenji-kun, I know you are afraid. I am afraid too. But remember, your grandfather died with honor at Port Arthur fighting the Russians. If you must die, die knowing you protected our home. Your little sister Yuki asks about you every day. She is only 8 years old. She made me promise to tell you she loves you. Come home if you can. But if you cannot, know that we are proud, you are our samurai. Mother. The words made his chest tight. He had not told his mother he was afraid. He had not told anyone. To admit fear was to admit weakness. But alone in his cockpit, waiting for the launch order, Takahashi was terrified. Not just of dying without understanding why. The propaganda posters showed Americans as grotesque monsters with fangs and claws. The officers spoke of American brutality of torture, of a nation of criminals and cowards who would collapse when faced with true Japanese spirit. But Takahashi had played baseball in high school before the government banned American sports. He had secretly listened to jazz records his father hid in the attic. He had dreamed of studying engineering at the University of California before the war made that impossible. How could people who created jazz music and baseball be monsters? How could a nation that built such wonders be cowards? He pushed the questions aside. Doubt was treason. Thinking was dangerous. He had a mission. Vice Admiral Takeshi Yamada, commander of the Mobile Fleet, had assembled 9 aircraft carriers with 473 aircraft. Intelligence reported the Americans had 7 carriers in the area, maybe 300 fighters. The numbers favored Japan. The experience favored Japan. Victory was certain. The flight deck officer raised his flag. Engines roared louder. The first Zero raced down the deck and lifted into the sky. Then another. Then another. The choreography of a carrier launch, 300 aircraft rising into the morning sun, should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like a funeral procession. Takahashi's turn came. The deck officer pointed forward. Takahashi pushed the throttle to full power. The Zero vibrated. The engine screamed. The deck officer dropped his flag. Takahashi released the brakes and the fighter shot forward, accelerating down the wooden deck. 60 miles per hour, 70, 80. The bow of the carrier rushed toward him. Easton. Then empty air, the drop toward the ocean, the engine pulling him up and away. He had done it, his first carrier takeoff in combat. He was airborne. He circled the carrier once, watching other Zeros and dive bombers and torpedo planes rising to join the formation. The sky filled with Japanese aircraft, 300 metal birds climbing toward combat. It looked unstoppable. What Takahashi did not know, what none of the Japanese pilots knew, was that every movement they made was being watched. American radar could see them from 150 miles away. American radio operators were already vectoring interceptors toward the incoming raid. American fighter directors were plotting courses and altitudes, positioning 40 Hellcat fighters at 22,000 feet directly above and behind the Japanese formation, invisible in the sun. Vice Admiral Yamada stood on the bridge of the Akatsuki and watched his strike force depart. 52 years old, a veteran of Pearl Harbor. One of the architects of Japanese naval dominance in the first 18 months of the Pacific War. He had watched American battleships burn at Pearl. He had witnessed the sinking of the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse off Malaya. He had commanded carriers when Japanese naval aviation was the finest in the world. That was 2 years ago. Now his pilots averaged 3 months of training instead of 2 years. His aircraft had mechanical problems that maintenance crews could barely fix because spare parts were scarce. His intelligence officers assured him the Americans had 7 carriers. His own fleet had 9. The math said victory was possible. The Warrior Code said victory was mandatory. There was no third option. The Marianas could not fall. If the Marianas fell, American bombers would reach the home islands. The war would be lost. Yamada turned to his operations officer. The Americans cannot withstand this assault. Their pilots lack discipline. Their tactics are crude. By sunset, we will control these waters. The operations officer said nothing. He had learned not to question the admiral's certainty, but he had also seen the reconnaissance reports. The Americans were learning. Their fighters were getting better. Their tactics were evolving. And there were rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that the Americans might have more carriers than intelligence estimated. 200 miles to the east, Admiral Robert Mitchell stood on the bridge of the USS Enterprise and read the latest intelligence summary. 48 years old, commander of Task Force 58, 15 aircraft carriers, 475 Hellcat fighters. Mitchell had lost friends at Coral Sea and Midway. He had learned the cost of overconfidence. He had spent 2 years building a system designed to turn air combat into a science rather than a test of individual courage. His staff had delivered the intercepted Japanese messages at 0600 hours. Every detail of Yamada's plan, every carrier position, every aircraft count, every timing element. The Japanese believed their codes were unbreakable. They were wrong. American cryptographers had broken the Imperial Japanese Navy codes in mid-1942. For 2 years, every major Japanese naval operation had been compromised before it began. Mitchell looked at the intercept summary and allowed himself a slight smile. They think we have 7 carriers. They think we have 300 fighters. They have no idea what's waiting for them. A young staff officer approached. Admiral, the Japanese strike force launched at 0530. Current bearing 265, range 150 miles, altitude between 10,000 and 20,000 feet. Estimated composition, 69 aircraft. First wave. Mitchell nodded. Our fighters are positioned, yes sir. 40 Hellcats at Angels, 22 directly above their approach vector. Fighter directors have radar lock. Intercept in approximately 16 minutes. Mitchell walked to the window and looked out across the ocean. Somewhere beyond that horizon, young Japanese pilots were flying toward what they believed would be a glorious victory. Most of them would be dead in 30 minutes. Mitchell had ordered that. He would live with that. But he had also ordered something else, something unprecedented, something that would define what kind of men Americans were. He turned to his operations officer. Make sure the rescue protocols are clear. Any enemy pilot in the water, we pick them up. Any prisoner we treat according to Geneva Convention. Feed them. Give them medical care. Treat them with dignity. Is that understood? The operations officer hesitated. Sir, some of the men might object. After Pearl Harbor, after what the Japanese did to our POWs in the Philippines, Mitchell's voice went cold. I don't care what some of the men think. We fight this war to prove our values are worth defending. If we act like barbarians, what are we defending? Those Japanese pilots are somebody's sons. When we shoot them down, we do it professionally. When we capture them, we treat them like human beings. That's an order. Yes, sir. Mitchell had a son serving on a destroyer in this same task force, 18 years old, fresh out of training. Mitchell thought about him every day, worried about him every night, prayed for him every morning. The Japanese pilots heading toward his fleet were the same age as his son. Some were younger. They had mothers who worried, sisters who prayed. They were human beings who had been lied to by their government-fed propaganda about American devils and sent to die in a war their leaders were losing. Mitchell could hate the Japanese government. He could hate the military commanders who started this war. But he refused to hate the young pilots flying toward him. They deserved to be defeated decisively so this war would end faster. They did not deserve to be dehumanized. This was the fundamental difference between the two admirals. Yamada saw his pilots as weapons to be expended for glory. Mitchell saw his pilots as young men to be protected through superior preparation. Yamada believed warrior spirit would overcome material disadvantage. Mitchell believed material advantage existed to minimize casualties on both sides by ending the war faster. One of these philosophies would save lives. The other would destroy an entire generation of Japanese naval aviators in a single day. Lieutenant Carson walked to his Hellcat and ran his pre-flight inspection. The F-6F Hellcat was everything the Zero was not. Heavy, armored, powerful. It weighed 15,000 pounds, twice the Zero's weight. It mounted 650 caliber machine guns that could fire 4,800 rounds per minute combined. The pilot sat behind armor plating. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. The engine generated 2,000 horsepower. Where Zeros excelled at dogfighting through maneuverability, Hellcats dominated through speed, firepower, and survivability. The doctrine was simple. Never turn with a Zero, never get slow, never get predictable. Dive at 400 miles per hour. Fire a 2-second burst. Extend away at full throttle. Climb back to altitude. Repeat. Boom and zoom, energy fighting, mathematics over mysticism. Carson had learned this the hard way. December 1942, Guadalcanal. His wingman Tommy Henderson had tried to turn fight with a zero. The Japanese pilot, more experienced in flying a more maneuverable aircraft, had gotten inside Tommy's turn and shot him down. Carson heard Tommy's last words over the radio. I turned with him. Stupid. Tell my mom I'm sorry. Then static. Carson had flown home alone that day. He had written to Tommy's mother. He had promised her that her son's death would mean something that other pilots would learn from Tommy's mistake. Carson had spent the next 18 months training replacement pilots, drilling them on the tactics that kept him alive. Never turn with zeros. Speed is life. Altitude is insurance. Come home. He climbed into his Hellcat's cockpit and touched the small photo taped to the instrument panel. Tommy in his flight suit, smiling, giving a thumbs up. The photo had been taken 3 days before he died. Carson kept it as a reminder. Courage without discipline gets you killed. Tactics without training gets you killed. Overconfidence gets you killed. The catapult officer gave the signal. Carson pushed the throttle forward. The Hellcat's engine roared, 2,000 horsepower pulling 14 tons of aircraft armor, ammunition, and fuel down the deck and into the sky. The acceleration pressed Carson back into his seat. The bow rushed toward him. Then the familiar drop off the deck. The moment of weightlessness. The engine pulling him up. He climbed to 20,000 feet and joined his division. 4 Hellcats in combat spread. 2 pairs of fighters separated by 200 yards, giving overlapping fields of fire and mutual support. Not the tight formations Japan still used, where pilots focused more on holding position than watching for threats. Flexible pairs that could support each other while maintaining situational awareness. The radio crackled. All fighters, this is home plate. Vampire inbound bearing 265 Angels, 18 many bogeys. Vector 265 standby for intercept. Carson felt his pulse quicken. This was it. The big one. Everything they had trained for. He checked his gun switches. Armed. He checked his gun sight. Illuminated. He scanned the sky, looking for the enemy formation. At 10:42 hours, he saw them. 69 Japanese aircraft in a stepped-up formation between 10,000 and 18,000 feet. Dive bombers, mostly. Yokosuka D-4Y Judies. Some older HED-3M Avals. A few torpedo bombers. No Zero escorts visible. Either they had separated during the flight or the Japanese had launched bombers without adequate fighter protection. Carson keyed his radio. Tally 11 o'clock low, Judies and Vals in formation, no fighter cover visible. His division leader responded. Roger, commence attack. Pairs tactics, watch your 6. Carson rolled inverted and dove. The Hellcat accelerated past 400 miles per hour. The wind screamed. The target grew larger. A Judy dive bomber painted dark green red circles on the wings, completely unaware of the death, diving toward it from above and behind. At 300 yards, Carson fired. 6 streams of 50 caliber tracers converged on the bomber. The effect was catastrophic. The Judy's engine exploded in a spray of burning fuel and metal. The aircraft disintegrated in midair. Carson pulled through the debris, rolled right, selected another target. The Japanese formation was breaking apart. Bombers scattered in all directions, jettisoning their bombs early, diving for cloud cover or the ocean surface. Some pilots never saw what hit them. They just exploded without warning. Others looked up too late and saw American fighters everywhere diving, shooting, climbing away before defensive gunners could respond. Takahashi saw his flight leader explode. 1 second, the bomber was flying straight and level. The next second, it was a fireball tumbling toward the ocean. Takahashi screamed into his radio but heard only static and the overlapping shouts of other pilots, calling warnings, calling for help, calling for their mothers. He looked up and saw them. American fighters. Dozens of them. Big, dark blue aircraft diving at impossible speeds, firing, pulling away before his eyes could track them. The propaganda had lied. These were not cowards. These were professionals executing a massacre with terrifying precision. Takahashi's bomber squadron was gone. Just gone. 12 aircraft reduced to burning wreckage in less than 3 minutes. His own aircraft shuddered as bullets walked across his left wing. Fabric tore. Metal screamed. His fuel gauge needle dropped. He was hit. leaking fuel, 150 miles from his carrier with a damaged aircraft and American fighters owning the sky. His training said to press the attack, die with honor, ram an American ship, take enemies with you. But his survival instinct, the one no amount of propaganda could erase, screamed at him to run. Live. Go home to Mother and Yuki. See them one more time. Takahashi broke formation, jettisoned his bomb into empty ocean, and dove for a cloud bank at 8,000 feet. Shame and terror fought for control of his mind. I am a coward. I abandoned my duty. I betrayed the Emperor. But I might live. I might see home. Above him, Carson watched the damaged Zero flee into the clouds. An easy kill. The Zero was trailing smoke. The pilot was running. One burst would finish it. Carson positioned for the shot finger on the trigger. Then he thought about Mitchell's words that morning. We prove our values by how we fight. We win the peace by how we treat the defeated. The Zero had jettisoned its bomb. It was no longer a threat. The pilot was clearly terrified, fleeing rather than fighting. Killing him would add one more number to Carson's kill count, but would not change the outcome of the battle. And somewhere in Japan, that pilot's mother was waiting for news, hoping her son would come home. Carson let him go. He pulled up, climbed back to altitude, and looked for new targets. The sky was full of American fighters now. Hellcats from 6 carriers converging on the raid. Every bomber the Japanese sent toward the fleet had to run a gauntlet of fighters vectored precisely to intercept. The fighter directors were reading the battle in real time, calling out priorities, directing fresh divisions toward unengaged targets. At 11:04 hours, 22 minutes after first contact, the massacre ended. 41 Japanese aircraft destroyed. The rest fleeing west, many damaged, most without bombs. Not one Japanese aircraft had reached the American carriers. Not one bomb had struck a ship. American losses 0. Aboard the Akatsuki Yamada received the first reports at 11:10 hours. His strike commander's voice came through the radio, tight with shock. Heavy fighter opposition. Attack disrupted, returning to carriers. Disrupted was code for destroyed. Yamada stood frozen, staring at his plotting board. 69 aircraft launched, maybe 30 would return, 40 aircraft and 40 pilots gone. In 22 minutes. But Operation A Go required commitment. The Marianas could not fall. The Americans had to be hurt, their defenses weakened. Yamada turned to his air operations officer. Launch the second wave. 130 aircraft, everything we have, immediately. Sir, we should wait for reconnaissance. We should assess the first waves of reports. We should... Now the Americans must be weakened. We continue the attack. The operations officer bowed and left to prepare the launch. Yamada stood alone on the bridge watching survivors from the first wave land. Their aircraft were riddled with bullet holes. Some crashed on landing because their landing gear had been damaged. Pilots climbed out, shaking, some unable to speak, others babbling about the number of American fighters, the precision of their attacks, the impossibility of breaking through. Among the survivors was Takahashi. He landed badly, the damaged Zero bouncing hard on the deck. Maintenance crews ran to his aircraft and stared at the bullet holes, the torn fabric, the leaking fuel. Takahashi climbed out and vomited on the deck. His hands would not stop shaking. A veteran pilot, a man who had fought at Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, grabbed Takahashi's shoulders. Where are the others? Where is the squadron? Takahashi looked at him with empty eyes. Gone. No, gone. The Americans were everywhere. I jettisoned and ran. I am a coward. The veteran pilot said nothing. He had seen this look before in the eyes of young pilots, after Midway, after the Coral Sea, after every battle where Japanese certainty met American preparation. He released Takahashi and walked away. Takahashi sat on the deck, still wearing his flight gear, still shaking. A maintenance chief approached. Your Zero needs major repairs. 2 hours minimum, maybe more. Tell them to hurry. I have to fly again. The admiral ordered another wave. The chief stared at him. You just landed. You're in shock. You can barely stand. Orders. I fly when my aircraft is ready. But Takahashi's Zero would not be ready in time for the second wave, which meant he would sit on the carrier's deck and watch 130 more aircraft launch toward the American fleet, and he would know with absolute certainty that most of them would not come back. 200 miles away, Mitchell received the intercept report. First wave destroyed. Minimal damage to our forces. Second wave preparing to launch estimated 130 aircraft. He turned to his staff. They are committing everything. They cannot accept defeat. Position the intercepts 50 miles out this time. Set up the killing zone even earlier, and make sure the rescue protocols are ready. We are going to have Japanese pilots in the water today. I want them picked up and treated properly. The staff officers exchanged glances, but said nothing. Mitchell's reputation for valuing human life, even enemy life, was well known. Some thought it was weakness. Others recognized it as the kind of strength that won peace, not just wars. Carson landed aboard the Lexington at 11:30 hours, 600 pounds of fuel remaining, ammunition expended, 2 confirmed kills. He climbed out of his cockpit and immediately asked the deck crew for the squadron tally. First wave destroyed, sir. 41 confirmed kills. 0 American losses. Second wave inbound. They want you refueled and rearmed immediately. Carson nodded. How long? 20 minutes, sir. He walked to the ready room, grabbed a cup of coffee and a sandwich. His hands were steady. His pulse was normal. This was his 88th combat mission. The fear never went away completely, but the professionalism of preparation kept it manageable. He thought about the 0 pilot he had spared and wondered if the young man had made it home. Probably not. The battle was just beginning, but at least Carson had given him a chance. Somewhere in that chance, in that moment of mercy, was the difference between American and Japanese naval aviation. Not in the aircraft or the tactics or the technology, in the fundamental belief about what kind of war they were fighting. Americans fought to end wars and go home. Japanese fought for abstract concepts of honor and glory that required death to validate. Carson finished his coffee, grabbed his flight gear, and headed back to his Hellcat. The second wave was coming, and he would be ready. The second wave launched at 11:07 hours. 130 aircraft climbed into the Pacific Sky engines, roaring propellers churning the humid air. From the deck of the Akatsuki, it looked like salvation. A massive strike force, the largest Yamada could assemble, darkening the sky as they formed up and turned east toward the American fleet. Takahashi watched them go. He stood on the carrier's deck, still in his sweat-soaked flight suit, watching young pilots barely older than himself fly toward the same hell he had just escaped. Some of them waved as they passed overhead, thinking this was the glorious moment their training had prepared them for. Takahashi wanted to scream at them to turn back, to run, to save themselves. But cowards do not give advice to warriors. So he stood silent and watched them disappear into the distance. His hands had stopped shaking, but his mind had not stopped replaying the last hour. The sight of his squadron leader exploding without warning, the sound of friends screaming on the radio, the smell of burning fuel and flesh, the impossible number of American fighters, professional and precise, executing them like a firing squad executes prisoners. No drama, no hesitation, just cold mechanical death delivered at 400 miles per hour. The maintenance chief approached. Your 0 needs a new engine. We do not have spare parts. It will be days before she flies again. Takahashi nodded, a reprieve he had not asked for but desperately needed. He would not have to fly in the second wave. He would not have to face those American fighters again. Not today, but he would have to watch. 200 miles east, Lieutenant David Hayes climbed to 20,000 feet and waited for the second wave to appear on radar. 25 years old. 7 confirmed kills. A veteran of Tarawa and Palau who had learned the same lessons Carson learned. Never turn with zeros. Energy is life. Precision beats passion. His radio crackled at 11:30 hours. All fighters, this is home plate. Multiple bogies bearing 270, range 40 miles, Angels 15. Large formation. Vector 270 for intercept. Hayes turned west and scanned the horizon. At 30 miles, he saw them. Not a formation, a gaggle. 130 Japanese aircraft stacked between 10,000 and 20,000 feet with no tactical organization. Bombers, torpedo planes, and 0 fighters all mixed together like a flock of birds scattered by a storm. They had launched in a rush and never properly formed up. The tight, disciplined formations that opened the Pacific War were gone, replaced by desperation and chaos. Hayes keyed his radio. Tally-ho. Multiple bandits, no organization. Engaging highest element. He selected 6 Zeros flying at 18,000 feet, the highest group in the gaggle, and dove. The mathematics were simple. Hayes had altitude and speed. The Zeros had neither. He would dive, shoot, extend away before they could react, climb back to altitude and repeat. Boom and zoom. The doctrine that turned air combat from a test of courage into a science of energy management. His first burst hit the lead Zero at 300 yards. 6 streams of 50 caliber tracers, 400 rounds converging in 2 seconds, tearing through the unarmored fuselage like paper. The Zero came apart in mid-air, wings separating from the fuselage, the pilot still strapped in his seat as both pieces tumbled toward the ocean. Hayes pulled right and climbed, gaining 5,000 feet before rolling back toward the formation. The other Zeros were turning, trying to bring their superior maneuverability to bear, but Hayes refused to engage on their terms. He dove again, selected another target, fired, watched it burn, extended away. Around him, dozens of Hellcats were doing the same thing. The American fighters had altitude, speed, firepower, and most importantly, discipline. They dove through the Japanese formation, shot with devastating accuracy, and climbed away before defensive fire could track them. The Zeros tried desperately to dogfight, pulling into the tight turns, where they held the advantage, but the Hellcats simply refused to turn. They dictated the terms of engagement completely. For the Japanese pilots, it was a nightmare. They could see the Americans. They could turn towards them, but they could never catch them. The Hellcats were always faster, always above body, always extending away before the Zeros could close. It was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. Among those Japanese pilots was a young man named Hiroshi Nakamura, flying his first combat mission. 20 years old, 4 months of training. He had been told the Americans were cowards who would run when faced with Japanese fighting spirit. Instead, he watched American fighters tear through his formation with mechanical precision, destroying aircraft faster than he could count. His squadron leader exploded. His wingman caught fire and spun into the ocean. The bomber formation they were supposed to escort scattered like leaves in a typhoon. Nakamura pulled his Zero into a desperate turn, trying to get his gun sight on an American fighter. But the Hellcat just accelerated away, climbed out of reach, and disappeared. Nakamura's radio was chaos. Pilots screaming warnings, calling for help, reporting kills that never came because they died before finishing their sentences. He realized with cold clarity that he was going to die. Not heroically, not gloriously, just die shot down by an enemy who fought with such overwhelming superiority that resistance was meaningless. Then he saw Hayes diving toward him. The Hellcat came from directly above, invisible, until the last second, diving at a speed Nakamura's Zero could never match. Hayes fired. Nakamura jerked his stick hard left, the Zero responding instantly, pulling into a turn so tight that gravity crushed him into his seat. The tracers missed by inches, but Hayes did not follow. He extended away, gained altitude, and set up for another attack. Nakamura realized he was being hunted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who would not make mistakes. Someone who would kill him on the next pass or the one after that because Nakamura had no way to escape. He did the only thing his survival instinct allowed. He pushed his stick forward, dove toward the ocean, and ran. Away from the formation, away from the mission, away from honor and duty and everything he had been taught. He ran because dying seemed less important than seeing his family one more time. Hayes watched him go and made the same choice Carson had made an hour earlier. The Zero was fleeing, no longer a threat. Shooting it down would not change the battle's outcome. Hayes turned back toward the main formation and found new targets. At 11:44 hours, 37 minutes after the second wave entered American airspace, the slaughter ended. Of 130 Japanese aircraft launched, 98 were destroyed. 32 returned to their carriers, most damaged, several crashing on landing because pilots were wounded or aircraft were too shot up to fly properly. Total effective losses from the second wave exceeded 100 aircraft. American losses: 2 Hellcats shot down by intense anti-aircraft fire when they pursued Japanese bombers too close to the fleet's defensive perimeter. Both pilots were rescued by destroyers. The exchange ratio was 13 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American loss. But numbers alone could not capture the strategic catastrophe unfolding for Japan. These were not just aircraft being lost. They were pilots, trained naval aviators who had taken years to develop before the war and now took months because Japan's training pipeline could not keep pace with losses. Every pilot killed today was irreplaceable. If you served in World War II, you understand this. You remember what it felt like when you realized the enemy was not invincible, that their mystique was propaganda, that superior preparation beat superior spirit every single time. You remember the moment when fear turned to confidence, when you knew your side had learned the lessons and built the systems to win. If your father flew in the Pacific, he told you about days like this, days when everything came together and the outcome was never in doubt. Share your memories in the comments. Tell us about the moment you knew we were going to win. Aboard the Akatsuki Yamada stood on the bridge reading loss reports that destroyed his last illusions about Japanese naval superiority. First wave, 41 aircraft lost. Second wave, 98 aircraft lost. 139 aircraft and 139 pilots gone in 2 hours. Two complete strike waves sent to annihilate the American fleet, and the Americans remained untouched. His operations officer approached carefully. Admiral, we have fewer than 100 operational aircraft remaining across all 9 carriers. We have launched 200 aircraft and fewer than 70 have returned in flyable condition. We cannot sustain these losses. I recommend we withdraw to preserve the fleet. Yamada turned on him, face flushed with rage and shame. Withdrawal means abandoning Saipan, abandoning the Marianas. If we lose the Marianas, American bombers will reach Tokyo. The war will be lost. Everything will be lost. We cannot withdraw. Then what do you propose, sir? We do not have enough aircraft to mount another effective strike. The Americans clearly have more carriers than intelligence reported. They have radar we did not know about. They have tactics we cannot counter. Continuing to attack is suicide. The word hung in the air between them. Suicide. The operations officer had said what everyone on the bridge was thinking, but no one dared speak. Continuing Operation Ego meant sacrificing the mobile fleet for no strategic gain. But withdrawing meant admitting defeat, losing face, accepting that the Americans had outfought, outthought, and overwhelmed Japanese naval aviation. Yamada stared at the plotting board. 9 carriers remained operational, but carried fewer than 100 aircraft total between them. Not enough to challenge American air superiority. Not enough to protect the fleet from American counterattack. Barely enough to defend against a determined American strike. Prepare a third wave. 47 aircraft, everything that can still fly. They launch at 1300 hours and attack in coordination with land-based aircraft from Guam. The Americans will have to divide their defenses. Some of our aircraft will break through. The operations officer bowed and left without another word. There was nothing to say. The admiral had made his decision. More young pilots would die in the next few hours. The only question was, how many? Takahashi sat in the ready room below deck surrounded by other pilots who had survived the first 2 waves. No one spoke. What was there to say? They had watched their friends die. They had watched the invincible Imperial Japanese Navy get destroyed by an enemy they had been taught to despise as weak and cowardly. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. An older pilot, one of the last veteran Marines from Pearl Harbor, finally broke the silence. The Americans have changed. When we attacked their fleet in 41 and 42, they fought bravely but without coordination. Individual courage but no system. Now they fight like a machine, perfect coordination, radar-guided intercepts, overwhelming numbers. We taught them how to fight carriers, and they learned the lessons better than we did. Another pilot, bitter and exhausted, responded, "Then we have already lost. If they are better trained, better equipped, better organized, what is warrior spirit against that?" The veteran looked at him sadly. "That is the question, is it not? We were taught that spirit overcomes material. But I have been fighting Americans for 3 years, and I will tell you what I have learned. They have spirit too. They call it different things. Freedom, democracy, protection of home. But they fight just as hard as we do. The difference is they also have the industry, the technology, the training systems, and the tactical doctrine. We have only spirit, and today we learned that spirit is not enough." The room fell silent again. Outside, mechanics were preparing 47 aircraft for the third wave. Inside, pilots waited to be told they would fly again into the same hell that had consumed their friends. Some prayed, some wrote letters they knew might never be delivered. Some just sat and stared at nothing already dead inside. At 12:30 hours, the carrier Akatsuki shuddered from an explosion that no one immediately understood. The vibration was wrong. Not an aircraft crash, not anti-aircraft fire. Something else. Something from beneath the waterline. On the bridge, damage control reports started flooding in. Torpedo hit. Forward of the island. Aviation fuel tanks ruptured. Flooding in compartments 3 and 4. Yamada gripped the railing. Source of torpedo unknown, sir. No surface ships in range. Must have been a submarine. The USS Albacore had been shadowing the Japanese fleet for 6 hours, patiently maneuvering into attack position. Her captain had waited for the perfect moment when the carriers were distracted by flight operations and destroyer screens were focused on air defense rather than submarine threats. At 12:28 hours from 1,500 yards, he had fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. One had struck the Akatsuki forward of the island, rupturing aviation fuel lines and starting fires that would burn for the next 3 hours. The damage seemed manageable at first. The carrier maintained speed and continued preparing the third wave for launch. But ruptured fuel lines were leaking vapors throughout the ship. Ventilation systems designed to clear smoke were instead spreading volatile fumes into closed compartments. Aviation fuel vapor mixed with air in precisely the wrong ratios, searching for an ignition source. At 15:32 hours, 7 hours after the torpedo hit, accumulated fumes in the hangar deck found a spark from damaged electrical wiring. The explosion was catastrophic. The fireball ripped through the carrier's interior, detonating ammunition, igniting more fuel, triggering secondary explosions that tore bulkheads apart and collapsed decks. Within 3 minutes, the Akatsuki was doomed. Within 8 minutes, she was sinking. Within 15 minutes, she was gone, taking 1,200 sailors and 18 aircraft down with her. Yamada stood on the deck of the cruiser, Haguro transferred from the dying carrier by destroyer, watching his flagship sink beneath the waves. The ship that had carried him to Pearl Harbor. The ship that represented Japanese naval dominance. Gone. Just gone. Swallowed by an ocean that did not care about honor or spirit or destiny. His operations officer approached. Admiral, we still have 7 carriers operational, but we have lost the Akatsuki and more than 200 aircraft. Combined Fleet Headquarters is requesting status update. Yamada straightened his uniform and turned away from the sinking ship. Tell them losses are heavier than anticipated and we are repositioning for follow-up operations. It was face-saving language for retreat. The operations officer understood. Everyone on Haguro's bridge understood. Operation A-Go had failed. The decisive battle Japan needed to win was lost. The Marianas would fall. American bombers would reach Tokyo. Everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, but Yamada could not say those words out loud. Not yet. Not while he still commanded a fleet, even a shattered one. So he used the euphemisms and postponed the reckoning. The third wave launched at 1,300 hours from the remaining carriers. 47 aircraft, everything that could still fly. They flew east toward the American fleet with orders to coordinate with land-based aircraft from Guam. The theory was sound. Attack from multiple directions. Force the Americans to divide their defenses. Some aircraft would break through. The reality was slaughter. 15 Japanese aircraft reached the American fleet. All 15 were destroyed by the destroyer and cruiser screens' anti-aircraft fire before they could attack any carriers. The coordinated strike from Guam never materialized because American Hellcats intercepted the land-based aircraft before they could join up with the carrier strike. Total losses from the third wave 100%. The fourth wave launched at 1,500 hours. 82 aircraft from 6 carriers. Yamada's final operational reserves. Everything left. The plan was to attack the Americans, then divert to Guam to refuel and rearm before attempting another strike. But the Americans had moved. Admiral Mitchell had repositioned his task force northwest, pursuing the Japanese fleet while maintaining distance. The fourth wave flew east toward the last reported American position and found empty ocean. They circled for 30 minutes, searching burning precious fuel, growing more desperate. Finally, low on fuel and out of options, they turned toward Guam. Commander Michael Anderson led a flight of Hellcats from the carrier Bunker Hill, shadowing the lost Japanese formation. 25 years old, already an ace with 7 kills. He watched the Japanese aircraft flying in loose formation toward Guam and felt something almost like pity. These pilots were exhausted. Their aircraft were worn. They were lost, desperate, and heading into a trap they did not know existed. American fighters from 3 carriers had positioned themselves between the Japanese formation and Guam's airfields. As the Japanese aircraft approached the island at low-altitude engines sputtering from fuel exhaustion, American Hellcats attacked from above. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. 49 Japanese aircraft were destroyed while approaching Guam or attempting to land. The pilots were too tired to evade. The aircraft were too damaged to maneuver. Some crashed during landing because pilots could not see through exhaustion. Others were shot down on final approach, exploding just short of the runway. Anderson destroyed 4 aircraft in a single attack run, methodical and precise firing controlled bursts that wasted no ammunition. His wingman got 3. Other Hellcat pilots claimed 5, 6, 7 kills as they worked through the Japanese formation like farmers harvesting wheat. 30 survivors scattered to various islands. 10 eventually made it back to the Japanese fleet. The rest were stranded on enemy-held islands, surrounded by Americans with no way home. Among the stranded was Takahashi. His Zero, hastily repaired with salvaged parts, had been pressed into service for the 4th wave despite the maintenance chief's protests. Takahashi had flown for 4 hours searching for Americans who were not where intelligence said they would be, burning fuel he could not replace, growing more terrified with each passing minute. When his fuel gauge read empty, when his engine started coughing, when the choice became crash at sea or try for Guam, Takahashi chose Guam. He made it to the island, barely his engine dying as he crossed the beach. He landed hard on Guam's damaged airfield, the Zero's landing gear collapsing, the aircraft sliding 200 feet before stopping in a cloud of dust and smoke. Takahashi climbed out and collapsed on the ground. Around him, other Japanese aircraft were burning. American Hellcats circled overhead like vultures. The airfield was a graveyard of twisted metal and dead pilots. A sergeant approached him. "Can you fly again?" Takahashi looked at his demolished Zero, looked at the burning aircraft around him, looked at the American fighters above. "Number 1, I cannot fly again. Nothing can fly again." The sergeant nodded and walked away. Takahashi sat on the ground next to his destroyed aircraft and waited for what he did not know. Rescue that would not come. Orders that made no sense. Death that seemed more certain with every passing hour. He reached inside his flight suit and pulled out his mother's letter. The paper was stained with sweat and oil. The ink was smudged. But he could still read her words. "Come home, if you can." Takahashi looked at the burning airfield, at the American fighters overhead, at the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. Home was 2,000 miles away across an ocean controlled by the enemy. Home might as well have been on another planet. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it back inside his flight suit next to his heart. What Takahashi did not know, could not know, was that in 2 hours an American destroyer would approach close enough to Guam to shell the airfield. And in the chaos of that bombardment, a young American sailor would see Japanese pilots in the water, struggling, drowning. And that sailor would throw them life preservers, would pull them aboard, would wrap them in blankets and give them water, would treat them like human beings instead of monsters. And Takahashi's world, already shattered by the day's battles, would shatter again. But this time it would shatter into something new, something he had no words for yet, something that would take years to understand. The Americans called it mercy. But to Takahashi, sitting on Guam's ruined airfield, watching the sun set on the worst day of his life, it would feel like resurrection. 1,700 hours. The sun hung low over the Pacific, painting the ocean in shades of copper and gold. For most of the sailors aboard the American task force, it had been a day of unprecedented victory. For the Japanese mobile fleet, it had been a day of catastrophic losses. But for Ensign Kenji Takahashi, stranded on Guam's shattered airfield, the day was about to transform into something he had no framework to understand. The American destroyer USS Morrison approached Guam's western shore at 1730 hours, close enough to shell Japanese positions, but far enough to avoid coastal artillery. Her captain scanned the airfield through binoculars and saw what remained of the 4th wave. Burning aircraft, debris scattered across cratered runways, and in the water just off the beach, 3 Japanese pilots struggling against the current, trying to swim to shore from aircraft that had crashed short of the runway. The captain lowered his binoculars and turned to his executive officer. "There are men in the water, Japanese pilots. They will drown if we do not retrieve them." The executive officer hesitated. "Sir, we are under orders to shell this airfield." and picking up enemy combatants might expose us to shore fire. The captain's voice was firm. We shell the airfield after we pick up the pilots. No man drowns while I watch, even if he wore a different uniform this morning. Get rescue swimmers ready and bring those men aboard. Among the three pilots in the water was Takahashi. He had not jumped from his crash zero. The aircraft had simply slid into the ocean during his landing attempt, the damaged landing gear catching on debris and flipping the fighter into the shallow water just offshore. Takahashi had fought his way out of the sinking cockpit and surfaced gasping, swimming instinctively toward the beach. Then he saw the American destroyer. Close, maybe 200 yards. The ship's guns were trained on the airfield, but sailors on deck were pointing at him. Takahashi expected machine gun fire, expected to die in the water the same way so many of his friends had died in the air. He stopped swimming and simply floated, too exhausted to run, too broken to care. Instead of bullets, he saw something he would remember for the rest of his life. American sailors throwing orange life rings into the water, shouting in English words he didn't understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. "Swim to us. We will save you." Takahashi grabbed the life ring and let himself be pulled toward the destroyer. Strong hands reached down and hauled him up the cargo net that sailors had thrown over the side. He collapsed on the deck, coughing salt water, shivering despite the tropical heat. Around him, American sailors in blue uniforms stared down at him. He waited for the beating he had been told Americans gave to prisoners. Waited for the torture. For the cruelty his instructors had promised was the American way of war. A corpsman knelt beside him instead. Young, maybe 20 years old, carrying a medical kit, he wrapped a blanket around Takahashi's shoulders. The blanket was warm, dry, and smelled like American soap and laundry detergent. A smell Takahashi had never experienced before, but would remember forever as the smell of mercy. The corpsman checked him for injuries, gentle and professional. "Are you hurt? Can you understand me?" Takahashi's English was limited but adequate. "I understand. I am not hurt. I surrender." The corpsman smiled. "You are safe now. We will take care of you." Safe. The word in English sounded different than the Japanese word for safety, softer, more certain. Takahashi did not feel safe. He felt destroyed, humiliated, defeated. But he was alive. The Americans had pulled him from the water when they could have let him drown, when they could have shot him, when every piece of propaganda he had been taught said they would torture him. A sailor handed him a canteen. Drink, fresh water. Takahashi drank, and the water was cold and clean and tasted nothing like the rationed water on Japanese carriers. He drank until the canteen was empty, and the sailor simply filled it again from a tap and handed it back. "As much as you need. There is plenty. Plenty." Another concept Takahashi struggled to process. The Japanese military ran on scarcity. Rationed food, rationed water, rationed fuel. Every resource carefully measured and distributed according to rank and need. But this American sailor spoke of water as if it were infinite, as if giving a prisoner a second canteen was not even worth thinking about. The captain approached. "What is your name, son?" Takahashi stood shivering and tried to bow properly, despite the blanket wrapped around him. "Takahashi Kenji, Ensign, Imperial Japanese Navy. I am prisoner of war." The captain nodded. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed. You will receive food, medical care, and shelter." Do you understand? Takahashi understood the words but not the concept. Geneva Convention. He had heard of it in training, but his instructors had dismissed it as Western weakness, a set of rules that real warriors ignored. The Americans would claim to follow these rules he had been taught, but would violate them the moment it suited their purposes. "I understand." Takahashi paused, then added quietly, "Thank you for saving my life." The captain looked at him for a long moment. "You are somebody's son, probably somebody's brother. Your mother is worried about you right now. We fight to win this war, not to maximize suffering. You are our responsibility now. We take that seriously." The captain walked away, and Takahashi stood on the deck wrapped in an American blanket, surrounded by American sailors who had saved him instead of killing him, trying to reconcile what he was experiencing with everything he had been taught about the enemy. A cook appeared carrying a metal tray. The smell hit Takahashi before he saw the food. Real food. Cooked food. More food on one tray than he had seen in 6 months aboard the Akatsuki. A sandwich made with thick, sliced white bread, ham, cheese, lettuce, and butter. An apple. A cup of coffee. The cook set the tray on a bench. Figured you might be hungry. Eat up. Takahashi stared at the sandwich. His stomach cramped with hunger. He had eaten a handful of rice 12 hours earlier and nothing since. But touching the food felt wrong. Dangerous. What if it was poisoned? What if this was a test? The cook noticed his hesitation. It is not poisoned, kid. Just a sandwich, ham and cheese. Eat. Takahashi picked up the sandwich with trembling hands. The bread was soft, fresh, still slightly warm. He took a small bite and the taste exploded across his tongue. Real meat, real cheese, real butter. Flavors he had almost forgotten existed. He took another bite, then another. Then he was eating frantically, tears streaming down his face, unable to stop. The American sailors looked away, uncomfortable, witnessing his breakdown, but understanding it. They had seen newsreel footage of liberated Allied prisoners from Japanese camps. They knew what starvation looked like. This young Japanese pilot crying while eating a ham sandwich was experiencing the same thing in reverse. 6 months of near starvation ending in one simple meal. Takahashi finished the sandwich and wiped his eyes. I am sorry, I am weak. An older sailor, a chief petty officer with gray hair and kind eyes, shook his head. You are not weak, you are hungry. There is a difference. When is the last time you ate a real meal? Takahashi had to think. March, maybe April. Before that, I do not remember. We had rice, sometimes fish, very small portions. The chief nodded slowly. We heard the Japanese military does not feed its soldiers well. Is that true? It is considered weakness to complain about food. We are told that samurai spirit overcomes hunger, that Americans are soft because they care about comfort. The chief smiled without humor. Well, you just ate an American sandwich. Did it make you soft, or did it give you energy to survive? Takahashi looked at the empty plate. It gave me life. I was dying slowly and did not realize it until I tasted real food again. That is the difference between us and them. The chief gestured toward the east, toward the direction of the Japanese fleet. Your officers starve you and call it discipline. We feed our boys proudly because hungry men cannot fight well or think clearly. Which side sounds stronger to you now? The question hung in the air. Takahashi had no answer because the answer invalidated everything he had believed. If the Americans were right about food, what else were they right about? If his own officers had lied about American cruelty, what other lies had he been told? A voice over the ship's intercom interrupted his thoughts. All hands prepare for bombardment of enemy positions on Guam. Secure all prisoners below deck. The chief gestured for Takahashi to follow. Come with me. We will put you somewhere safe during the shelling. Then we will get you cleaned up and find you some dry clothes. Takahashi followed him below deck through passageways that were clean and well lit and maintained with a level of care he had never seen aboard Japanese ships. The destroyer's interior smelled like fresh paint and machine oil and coffee. Sailors nodded to him as he passed, not with hatred or contempt, but with the distant professional courtesy of men who understood he was no longer an enemy combatant, but a prisoner under their protection. The chief led him to a small compartment and pointed to a bunk. Sit here until the shelling is finished. Then we will move you to more permanent quarters. Are you comfortable? Takahashi sat on the bunk. The mattress was thin, but present. Japanese sailors slept on wooden platforms with no padding. This is comfortable. Thank you. The chief started to leave, then paused. What is your first name? Your family name is Takahashi, but what do you prefer to be called? Kenji. My name is Kenji. All right, Kenji, my name is Chief Miller. If you need anything, ask any sailor, and they will find me. You are safe here. No one will hurt you. That is a promise. Chief Miller left, and Takahashi sat alone in the compartment, listening to the muffled sounds of the destroyer's guns firing at Guam. Each concussion shook the ship slightly. He thought about the Japanese soldiers and pilots, still on that island being shelled by the ship that had saved him, his countrymen, his brothers in arms, and he felt a confusing mix of guilt, relief, and something else he could not name. 200 miles to the west, Admiral Mitchell stood on the bridge of the Enterprise reading the final casualty reports from the day's battle. 3 Japanese carriers sunk. Akatsuki Hiryu and the light carrier Chiyoda damaged beyond repair. Over 600 aircraft destroyed, including land-based aircraft from Guam. Approximately 445 trained pilots killed. American losses, 43 aircraft destroyed in air combat. 80 more would be lost tomorrow in a long-range strike he was planning. 76 aircrew killed or missing. The exchange ratio was devastating for Japan. 13 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American loss in combat. But Mitchell felt no satisfaction, only a grim recognition that he had just presided over the destruction of an entire generation of Japanese naval aviators. Young men who had been lied to by their government, fed propaganda about American weakness, and sent to die in a war their leaders were losing. His operations officer approached. Admiral Reconnaissance reports the Japanese fleet is withdrawing northwest at maximum speed. They are 275 miles away and opening the distance. We estimate they have fewer than 100 operational aircraft remaining across 7 carriers. Mitchell nodded. They are finished as an offensive force, but we need to make sure they cannot rebuild. I want to strike them tomorrow. Maximum range strike. Sink as many carriers as we can. Sir, 275 miles is beyond normal operational radius for our strike aircraft. Many pilots will not have sufficient fuel to return. We could lose 80 or more aircraft to fuel exhaustion. I know, but if we do not finish this now, if we let them escape and rebuild, this war continues. More boys die on both sides. We end it tomorrow decisively so fewer mothers lose sons in the long run. Prepare the strike for first light and ask for volunteers only. I will not order men to fly a mission where fuel exhaustion is likely. The operations officer saluted and left to organize the strike. Mitchell looked out at the ocean and thought about his own son serving on a destroyer somewhere in this task force. 18 years old, the same age as many of the Japanese pilots killed today. The thought made him sick. War was necessary sometimes. Evil had to be opposed. Aggression had to be stopped. But that did not make killing easier. It did not make the deaths of young men on either side less tragic. Mitchell had spent his entire career learning how to win wars. But victory felt hollow when you understood the human cost. He made a decision that would define his legacy more than any tactical brilliance. Mitchell turned to his communications officer. Send a message to all ships. Any Japanese pilots or sailors found in the water are to be rescued immediately and treated according to Geneva Convention standards. No exceptions, no delays. We win this war without becoming the monsters they were told we are. The communications officer looked surprised. Sir, some of the men might object. After Pearl Harbor, after the reports from our POWs in Japanese camps, I do not care what some of the men think. This is not about revenge. This is about proving our values are worth defending. If we treat prisoners with cruelty, we validate their propaganda. If we treat them with dignity, we prove our system is superior. Send the message. Yes, sir. That night, Takahashi slept on the USS Morrison in quarters that were cleaner and more comfortable than anything he had experienced in the Japanese military. A sailor had given him dry clothes, an American Navy uniform without rank insignia. It fit poorly, but it was clean and warm. He lay in the bunk and thought about his mother's letter. Come home if you can. He was alive. Against all odds, against everything he had expected, he had survived. But home was impossibly far away. And the Americans who had saved him were the same Americans who had destroyed his fleet, killed his friends, and were systematically dismantling the Japanese empire. He should hate them. Everything in his training said he should hate them. But they had fed him, saved him from drowning, treated him with more consideration than his own officers had shown in 6 months. How do you hate people who show you more humanity than your own side? Sleep came eventually, exhausted and dreamless. June 20th, 1944. Dawn broke over the Pacific with the same golden light as the day before, but the ocean had changed. Debris from destroyed aircraft floated on the surface. Oil slicks marked where ships had sunk. The smell of smoke and fuel still hung in the air. Lieutenant Carson stood on the Lexington's flight deck at 0600 hours, looking at his Hellcat and doing calculations in his head. The strike briefing had been clear. Target Japanese carriers 275 miles northwest. Fuel capacity enough for maybe 250 miles round trip at optimal consumption. The math did not work. His wingman approached. We are not making it back, are we? Carson shook his head. Not all of us, maybe half. Depends on fuel consumption, combat time, how efficiently we fly. Admiral asked for volunteers. You can sit this one out. The wingman laughed without humor and missed the chance to finish what we started yesterday. No thanks. Besides, if I bail out now, I will spend the rest of my life wondering if I was brave enough when it mattered. I am in. Carson nodded. He understood. This was not about glory or revenge or proving anything. This was about ending the war faster, about making yesterday's deaths mean something, about ensuring fewer pilots would have to fly missions like this in the future because the Japanese carrier force would be eliminated as a strategic threat. 216 aircraft launched at 0624 hours. Hellcats, Helldiver dive bombers, Avenger torpedo planes. They flew west into the rising sun toward the extreme edge of their operational radius. Pilots calculated fuel consumption rates and knew most would not have enough to return. They launched anyway. Carson's radio crackled as they approached the target area. Strike leader to all aircraft. Target acquired 11 o'clock 15 miles. 3 carriers, multiple escorts. Make every shot count. We may not get another chance. The attack lasted 18 minutes. Dive bombers screamed down from 10,000 feet. Torpedo planes came in low and fast. Hellcats provided cover, engaging the few Japanese fighters that rose to defend the fleet. Carson watched the carrier Ryuho take 2 bomb hits amidships and 1 torpedo to the stern. The ship lost power, slowed, and began listing. Fires spread across the flight deck. At 1918 hours, the Ryuho's magazines detonated in a massive explosion that broke the carrier in half. She sank in less than 3 minutes. 20 American aircraft were shot down by anti-aircraft fire during the attack. The remaining 196 turned east and began the long flight home. That was when the real crisis began. Carson's fuel gauge read 20 gallons. Distance to the task force 300 miles. Flight time required 90 minutes. Fuel remaining 30 minutes maximum. The mathematics of death. He was not going to make it. His radio filled with similar reports. Pilots calculating the same impossible equation. Some started ditching near destroyers positioned along the return route. Others flew as far as they could before engines quit, and they glided down to water landings in darkness. Carson pushed his mixture to full lean, reduced his throttle to minimum sustainable power, and prayed. The Hellcat's engine ran smoothly for 20 minutes, then began to cough. The fuel gauge read empty. The engine coughed again, running on fumes and momentum. His wingman's voice came over the radio. My engine just quit. I am ditching. See you on the other side, James. Carson watched the Hellcat glide down and hit the water in a controlled crash landing. The pilot climbed out and waved. A destroyer was already moving toward him. Carson hoped they would get there in time. His own engine coughed harder now. Losing power, altitude dropping, the ocean rising to meet him. He was 40 miles from the fleet. Might as well be 400. He prepared to ditch, reviewing the procedure in his mind. Wheels up, flaps down, hit the water at minimum speed, canopy open. Be ready to exit fast before the aircraft sinks. Then he saw it. A glow on the horizon, faint at first, then unmistakable. Lights. The fleet had turned on lights. Every ship blazing with illumination in clear violation of blackout doctrine. Searchlights pierced the darkness. Carrier decks were lit like football stadiums. Destroyers became beacons. Carson's radio erupted with voices. They lit the fleet. They are showing us the way home. Keep flying. We can make it. His engine coughed one last time and quit completely. Propeller windmilling, silence except for the wind. Carson was gliding now, trading altitude for distance, aiming for the lights. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. He could see the Lexington's deck. So close. Almost there. The Hellcat crossed the carrier's stern at 200 feet, sinking fast. Carson dropped his landing gear and flaps, slowing the aircraft, stretching the glide. The deck rushed toward him. The landing signal officer guided him with lit wands. Left, right, cut throttle. But there was no throttle. No engine. Just momentum and hope. The tailhook caught the number 3 wire. The Hellcat jerked to a stop. The engine was silent. The fuel gauge read absolute 0. Carson sat in the cockpit, unable to move, hands shaking, breathing hard. Deck crew swarmed the aircraft. Chief mechanic looked at the fuel gauge and whistled. You landed on fumes and prayers, Lieutenant. Nothing left, not even enough to taxi. Carson climbed out and his knees buckled. Strong hands caught him. A sailor steadied him. "Welcome home, sir. The Admiral says you boys earned it today." Carson looked across the deck at other aircraft landing in the darkness, guided by lights that should never have been turned on save by an admiral who valued human life more than doctrine. 80 aircraft would be lost that night to fuel exhaustion. But 60 pilots who should have died were saved by those lights. If you served, you understand what that meant. You remember commanders who valued your life, who made decisions that saved you when regulations said to abandon you, who proved that leadership is not about following rules, but about knowing when to break them for the right reasons. Share your stories in the comments. Tell us about the officer who saved your life by making the hard call. Admiral Mitchell stood on the Enterprise's bridge and watched rescue operations continue through the night. Destroyers plucking pilots from the ocean, carriers recovering aircraft in darkness. The calculated risk of lighting the fleet had worked. No Japanese submarines attacked. The lights saved dozens of lives, but the cost was real. 76 American aircrew were dead, 80 aircraft destroyed. Families would receive telegrams. Mothers would weep. The victory was decisive, but not cheap. Mitchell thought about the young Japanese pilot he had ordered rescued the day before. Takahashi Kenji. A report said the boy had cried while eating a sandwich, had called Americans kind when his own officers had starved him. That image haunted Mitchell more than the battle statistics. "We are fighting young men who have been lied to," he said quietly to his operations officer. "They think we are monsters. Every time we prove them wrong, we win a little bit of the peace. That matters as much as winning battles." 15 months later, December 1945, Takahashi stood on the dock in Tokyo Bay, repatriated from an American POW camp, staring at a city he barely recognized. The war had ended with atomic bombs and unconditional surrender. Tokyo was rubble. His mother and sister had survived but lived in a cousin's damaged home. Japan was occupied by American forces. Takahashi had spent 15 months in American custody, 3 meals daily, medical care that fixed teeth he had neglected for years, English lessons, a library with books that were banned in Japan, guards who treated prisoners with professional distance but never cruelty. He had gained 20 pounds. His health had improved. He had learned that the Americans who destroyed his fleet did so not from hatred, but from necessity. His mother hugged him and wept. "You are alive. I prayed every day. You are alive." Takahashi held her and his little sister Yuki, now 10 years old, and tried to explain what he had learned. "The Americans are not what we were told. They fed me better than our own military, treated me with dignity, followed their laws even for enemies. Mother, everything the government told us was a lie." His mother touched his face. "You are home. That is all that matters now." But it was not all that mattered. Takahashi could not forget. The sandwich, the blanket, Chief Miller's kindness, the lights guiding American pilots home while risking the fleet. He had seen an alternative to the Bushido code that demanded death over surrender. He had experienced a society that valued individual life and dignity, and he could not unsee it. In 1947, Takahashi became a high school history teacher. He told his students the truth about the war, about Japanese aggression, about American values demonstrated through actions, not words, about the day he learned that real strength comes from treating enemies with humanity. Many Japanese criticized him, called him a traitor, an American sympathizer. But Takahashi did not care. He had seen both sides. He knew which one had shown him what it meant to be human. May 1974, Tokyo. Takahashi read in the newspaper that Admiral Robert Mitchell was visiting Japan as part of a friendship delegation. He was 78, now retired, but his name was unmistakable. The man who had commanded the task force, who had ordered prisoners treated with dignity, who had lit the fleet. Takahashi arranged a meeting through the American embassy. They met in a quiet restaurant. Mitchell did not remember the specific battle details from 30 years earlier. But when Takahashi explained who he was, what had happened, the Admiral's eyes filled with tears. "You were there June 19th, 44. I was shot down, rescued by your destroyer Morrison, fed a sandwich, treated with dignity. Admiral Mitchell, you showed us real honor, not the honor our officers taught us. Real honor, Human honor. Mitchell reached across the table and gripped Takahashi's hand. I am glad you survived. I am glad we did the right thing. That is what America is supposed to be about. Takahashi pulled out a worn photograph. This is my grandson, 8 years old. He grows up in peace because you won the war, but also won the peace. You taught me that enemies can become friends, that values matter more than victory. I have spent 30 years teaching my students this lesson. Mitchell wiped his eyes. Then we did not fight in vain. If you can teach the next generation what we learned, if former enemies can meet like this, then all those boys who died mattered. They sat together for 2 hours. Two old men who had tried to kill each other once, now bound by mutual respect and the recognition that humanity transcends nationality. Lieutenant Carson, now 55 and flying commercial airliners, joined them later that afternoon. When he learned that Takahashi was the pilot he had spared in the clouds, both men wept. Why did you let me live? Takahashi asked. Because killing you would not have helped end the war. You had jettisoned your bombs. You were running. My admiral taught us to fight to end wars, not to maximize death. I am glad I made that choice. Takahashi reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn letter. This is the letter my mother wrote to me before the battle. I carried it next to my heart. You saved her son. She died last year, but she lived to see her grandchildren because of your mercy. Carson held the letter carefully, reading the Japanese characters he could not understand, but whose meaning was universal. A mother's love, a prayer for safety, the hope that her child would come home. I am glad I let you live, Carson said quietly. I am glad we both made it home. The three men sat together as the sun set over Tokyo, a city rebuilt from ashes, living proof that former enemies could become allies, that mercy mattered more than revenge, that the values America fought for in 1944 still resonated 30 years later. If you are watching this and you served, you know what this means. You carried those values forward. You showed the world that America fights for something larger than conquest. You proved that our strength comes not from our weapons, but from our willingness to show humanity even to enemies. If your father or grandfather served, share this video with your family. These stories matter. They remind us what we are really defending. Not just territory or resources or pride, but the idea that every person has dignity, that even in war, humanity must endure, that real victory comes when former enemies can meet as friends and recognize the values that make peace possible. June 19, 1944. The day 350 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky. The day American preparation met Japanese overconfidence. The day a young pilot learned what freedom means from the men who were trying to kill him. The day an admiral proved that valuing life matters more than following doctrine. The day mercy won a battle that tactical brilliance alone could never win. They came expecting victory. They found annihilation. But in that annihilation, in the ashes of defeat, in the kindness of enemies, Kenji Takahashi found something more valuable than any military triumph. He found the truth. And he spent the rest of his life teaching that truth to others. Real strength is not the ability to destroy your enemy. Real strength is knowing when to show mercy. Real honor is not dying for abstract ideals. Real honor is treating every human being with dignity. Real victory is not counting bodies. Real victory is building a peace where former enemies can meet as friends and recognize the humanity they share. That is what America fought for in World War II. That is what the greatest generation understood. That is what we must never forget. Admiral Robert Mitchell died in 1983. His final words to his family were about the lights, about the decision to risk the fleet to save pilots, about choosing humanity over doctrine. They say leadership is about making hard choices, but the hardest choice is always choosing to value life when death would be easier. Kenji Takahashi died in 2015. His grandson spoke at the funeral and told the story of the sandwich, the blanket, the American sailors who saved a terrified boy who had been taught to hate them. My grandfather taught us to judge people by their actions, not propaganda. The Americans proved their values through mercy. We must remember that. Lieutenant James Carson attended that funeral. 96 years old, frail but determined. He placed a model Hellcat on the casket. Thank you for teaching others what we learned the hard way. There are no winners in war, only survivors who must build the peace. This is the story of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, not just the tactics or the technology or the numbers. but the human truth underneath. The moment when enemies discovered their shared humanity. The day when victory was measured not just in destroyed aircraft, but in lives saved, dignity preserved, in a peace built on values that transcended the battlefield. Remember this story. Share it. Teach it to your children and grandchildren. Because the lesson matters now as much as it did 80 years ago. We are strongest when we remember that our enemies are human. We win when we prove our values through actions. And peace endures when former enemies can meet as friends and recognize the humanity that war tried to obscure but could not destroy. That is what America means. That is what the greatest generation fought for. That is what we must never forget.